There's another aspect to what we were discussing earlier about this sort of like Boolean mindset that people have. Is it tested? Is it not? And one of the things that ideology has led most teams, at least the majority that I run into, to conclude is that there is a single bucket for every app called test. And you just put tests in it, and it's, you're lucky if it has directories that are nested underneath there in terms of organizing the tests. And there is a default sort of assumption, even on I would say highly competent teams, you might be able to expect that there are unit tests that will indeed run locally of most things that are added. And there might be like one integration test that maybe, will run the whole application and just prove that the feature works. If you added widgets to an existing application, maybe you would expect that integration test to create a widget, read some widgets, update a widget, and delete a widget, right? And just again, do that CRUD flow for n times for n features over the life of the system. And there's two things that make tests very, very expensive to run that you hit on. One, on the first bit, is this logical organization failure on our parts. So what I would say is let's say that you're building a system that interacts with early client of ours, interacts with the paging network on electrical grids to communicate to thermostats to make them go up and down when it's really hot outside in Texas. We could, if we wanted to, write every single test with the assumption that a thermostat on a breadboard with this serial number is plugged in and powered on and on this network so that we can actually interface with it through every test, even the tests that have nothing to do with that particular integration. Even if our architecture could be built in such a way that we could just sort of have a driver to that thing that we could easily mock out and get away from that. But if we walk into the assumption that we need a maximally real test, every single thing this system does, we need to be able to prove scientifically that we're going to be able to go completely end to end. If that's your orientation, whether explicitly you're buying into it or implicitly I don't know, we've got a test directory and every test just needs at least one test needs to talk to this thermostat, so we just have to assume that they all do. That is a failure to organize based on the constraints that you're under. And so what I would encourage people to do is have multiple test suites, and work backwards. So what's the most resource contented environment that you might have? Maybe it's spinning up 100 different servers and so forth that are operating under a particular scale. Great. We're going to do the bare minimum number of testing to achieve confidence there. And then we're going to, break out a new bucket where you don't have access to that and everything else will default to that until we can find another really expensive resource contendy thing to do. And then we're going to, try to increasingly make the default place where people put tests into the least integrated, least complicated, necessary infrastructure for them to work. So that's, I think, in the end of the day, one of the answers to, I think, all these questions is you end up with some, trying to maximize the number of isolated units that can be tested in isolation, where you get really straightforward, not only fast feedback, but the feedback tells you exactly what line the failure was on kind of tests. And some number of locally integrated, everything's talking to everything else, but all inside of, that mono repo. Some number of contract tests that will actually just go and validate assertions against a running instance of some server that you integrate with. Some number of driver style tests to that kind of thermostat. And then, maybe just a golden path, hey, when we turn this all on in the real infrastructure that we really have, can I make a user and log in? And maybe that's the only thing that you actually needed to prove in that fully plugged together state. But then you'll sidle up to teams where they have 1,050 unit tests and you add one marginal unit test that just makes sure that emails are formatted correctly. And that's running up and down the stack and not the base time that is each individual test, if run logically and serially, is 4 minutes long. And every single time you add anything, it's this really outsized cost.